Oh, we should start. Okay, we do have less time. Okay, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dawn Starry. I'll introduce myself, and then Denora will introduce herself, and we will launch in because we have a little less time, and I know there might be questions, so we're going to hope to leave plenty of time for questions and brainstorming together. So I am a certified pastoral counselor, and for the last 10 years I have worked with I've been contracted with the nonprofit Survivors of Torture, working with asylum seekers and refugees. I do mental health work for individuals, families, groups. I work with kids in the schools, and I ran a women's group for a while as well. And the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker, you might know because these words are being thrown around a lot, but a refugee was vetted in their refugee camp, went through the many steps it takes to come. They come without legal status, and they can be on their way to a green card and to citizenship. An asylum seeker comes to the border, or they fly in with a visa and they say, I want to seek asylum, and then they have to go through the court system, which can take many years. I also have the honor of serving as the children's minister at St. Luke's, and I will share some of the stories that I've heard over the years. And I will say, certainly in the last 3 years, people's anxiety around immigration is just through the roof, right? Even people who are here with visas. So yeah, it's just off the charts, the level of anxiety and what feels like the ever-changing immigration policy in the United States right now.
Hi, good morning.
It is still morning, yeah.
I'm Vinona Reina, and I'm the Executive Director of the San Diego Organizing Project. We're a multi-faith community organization, and we've been in San Diego County for 40 years this year. And our involvement in the work currently, we are one of the core partners or founders of the San Diego Rapid Response Network. I was part of the original team that created a 24-hour hotline to report, monitor, and document ICE enforcement in neighborhoods. I have been an organizer with SDOP for the past 6 years. I've stepped into the director role just in September. I am the daughter of immigrants. My father was born in Mexico and my mom in El Salvador, and actually fled her country when she was 15 because of violence as well, and migrated to Mexico, eventually coming both undocumented to the United States in about 88. My mom was actually pregnant with me when she crossed the border through the mountains. So I was made in Mexico, but born here. I am actually born and raised in Riverside, and we're in the county. But I'm a border child. I lived in Mexico for a little bit while my mom was undocumented, going through a legalization process, and have lived in San Diego for 15 years. But my story today, or what I will share with you, is kind of like the process and the journey through the Rapid Response Network that started as a hotline that now has evolved into also the migrant shelter in San Diego, and kind of like our journey to create that as well.
So our goals and objectives today, the goal is to inform you all about what is going on at the border in San Diego County, what is being done, and what is happening as well. So also talk about what's going on in the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of San Diego, and then to talk about what is left undone. There is room for growth, and that will be the opportunity to talk about amongst each other, but we'll also talk about what can be done and what we as a diocese can do to support the people who are not necessarily in our pews, but are in our communities and our neighbors, but are sometimes in our pews as well. Whether they themselves are in the process of asylum seeking, or they have a deportation order out for them, or their family member has been deported. So just the anxiety, somebody pointed out last time, and this is a true statement, that this anxiety runs through families. Mm-hmm. So even if somebody is here, document it. If they've got a cousin who is not, or or I was thinking also, but this isn't my brain went to the kids I work with. They have family back in their home country too, and that anxiety of are they safe there? And it's not always known if they are safe. So that runs through families, and that means it runs through communities as well.
So before we get started, we also want to give all of you an opportunity to talk to each other. You're going to hear a lot about from us for the next hour. So maybe in 5 minutes, and we're not going to monitor and like give you time checks, but for 5 minutes, sharing with someone either around you that you don't know very well, but why you're here and what you're hoping to learn. So we'd like for you to just like talk to folks you don't know or talk to a couple people you don't know, and then at the end we'll hear from a couple of folks and kind of get a sense from the room why you decided to spend the next hour with us and also what you're hoping to get out of it. Sound good? Okay, so we are going to call you back at 11.
See, I guess I'll do it. Okay, clap once if you can hear me. Clap 2 times if you can hear me. That really does work without fail. So, all right, welcome to you all back to the larger group.
What did you all, or does anyone want to share? We probably have time for like 2 folks. Share either something that you shared that you'd want to share with the room, and or just something you heard that was inspiring or that must be heard by everyone else. A couple people.
I'll go quick.
Oh, you have to-
Yeah, I'll go quick. Just, we're all interested in the topic of dealing with the various issues which are multiple in the immigration arena. And I think most particularly what we as a church community, as church leaders in church community, can do to help be effective in addressing these issues.
Thank you.
And I just learned last night from a person that's trying to become a citizen, they have to pay $900 to become a citizen, which I think is ludicrous. That's just unbelievable.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, go ahead. It's actually, you're going to hear more from Denora.
I promise she'll go. She'll
Yes.
be nice. So I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about kind of what we've experienced as the border over the last 1.5, 2 years. So it was after 2016. We started noticing, or we have SDOP is part of a statewide network and national network known as PICO in California and PICO National, now known as Faith in Action. And we learn from each other and also share a lot of the work that we're doing. And we heard very quickly after the 2016 election that both in San Francisco and in LA, there were mass raids that took hundreds of people overnight. And that there were communities that were left without fathers, without family members, and no one knew how to find them. And there was just like this absence and lack of structure where their rapid response networks were created because of that. In San Diego, it was SDOP through Kevin Malone, the former director, and myself, and Norma Chavez-Peterson, the executive director of ACLU, that got together and really said, how can we be proactive and create something in the case that this happens in San Diego? So we did an all-call to organizations, to institutions in San Diego County, to agencies that provide direct services, and we gathered about 100 agencies in the little parish in National City, St. Anthony's Catholic Church, and had a conversation about dreaming or aspiring to create a rapid response network that would document, witness, and also just confirm if there is ICE enforcement in our region. So that was around the end of 2016, early 2017, and we created a rapid response hotline that's 24 hours, 7 days a week, that is dispatched by volunteers, a lot of which are faith leaders from across the county, who are receiving phone calls at all times when there's ICE enforcement in their neighborhoods. fast forward to October of 2018, the hotline gets a call that there are a dozen folks or so at the Greyhound station in downtown who essentially were just left there by ICE after being released from detention centers. So we sent volunteers, like most of you, to go and meet with these families, and we found out that yes, indeed, they were released. And because of a policy change from the new administration that basically took away any aid beyond the release from detention for asylum seekers. In the past, asylum seekers would be released and there would be aid or support to get them to their families. That went away under the new administration, which led to dozens of people being left on the street. Ultimately, we went into emergency crisis mode, gathered several organizations doing work on the ground, including SDLP, ACLU, Jewish Family Services, Employee Rights Center, Alliance San Diego, Casa Cornelia, Legal Aid Society, like all the organizations that do all this work, dropped everything and said, let's get together, how do we house this? Started talking to elected officials, and they all kept pointing the finger at each other and to the White House and to the county. So we eventually, as community, stepped up, an organization stepped up, created temporary shelters in 8 different places throughout the end of 2018. At first we were at Salvation Army, now I can disclose it. Then we were at different Catholic churches. Then we were at a couple of other churches that probably don't want to be named either. Eventually to having to advocate enough to get a county building that was empty for many, many years to allow us to run the asylum shelter there. Originally, there were hundreds of people coming at once. At one point, we were at a retreat center in South San Diego that only held 180. At times, we would get over 300 people. So congregations, and this was the role that SCOP played, since we're multi-faith and across the county, there were congregations that that had cots ready to go in case they needed to be in overflow that night. We had ministries or grupos, as I know in the Catholic Church, that were ready to come with the tamales or the pan dulce the next morning to feed the families. So the beginning of it was chaotic. It gave us an opportunity to organize around the county and to really also put pressure and also there was an election that had just happened locally as well. Supervisor Nathan Fletcher wasn't even sworn in at that time and actually led the process and the advocacy for the county building to be awarded. We had support from state electeds as well, and even then too from at that point the Governor Newsom was also instrumental in us in getting the new location. Ultimately, the shelter welcomes folks that have been released from detention after being detained at the border by a border agency, whether it's ICE or Border Patrol or U.S. Border Patrol. They have to have immigration documents with them, so in the worst type of way, but they have to have gone through the legal way and come with documents that allow them to go through that. And then they generally stay at the shelter anywhere from 48 hours to 72 hours on average. There's a report that was gathered through the U.S. Policy Center and then also UCSD's. There's a researcher known as, or his name is Tom Wong, who focuses on immigration data, who also helped us gather this. Most of the asylum seekers are coming from Central America, from Honduras, Guatemala, number 1 country, Honduras, and El Salvador. Other African countries, very few from Mexico. Almost 100% of them, it's like in the high 90s, are families. So a lot of younger parents. The average age is from early 30s to no more than 40 years old is the average family or adult that's coming, and they're mostly all coming with children. Even if they're adult children, but they're coming in family units, not individually. So the asylum shelter now, Rapid Response started as a hotline. We wanted to create this network of community members and agencies that were going to create this machine, our own community machine, that would be ready to fight a deportation machine if it came. Actually, in 2017, we had around 100 people in Escondido that were picked up as well. And the network was activated in that moment as well, and had also community members step up. So So I think historically in San Diego and in our county, it's been community members and agencies and organizations that have stepped up and filled the gaps where government have not. And I think that that's changing, and there's opportunities to change that as well. But our reality is that we also have, I believe, close to 100,000, if not more, undocumented people living in San Diego County. And because we are a border region, that means that the first 100, we have this 100-mile radius rule. And we, all of San Diego counts as a 100-mile radius that is border enforcement, or able to have border enforcement. So people living in San Diego County are always at risk. And San Diego was actually known as the #1 county in collateral arrest in our country. So anyone that opens the door is also putting their families at risk. So we're in a unique place, and I think historically in our country, they've been watching, right? Last year, I think we were on the news more than I could recall in my 30 years of life. But that our border is unique in the sense that we're welcoming, or that we're opening the doors for people from all parts of the country, but we're also at the center, or at a very vulnerable place where families that are already here, are established here, this is their home, are being impacted. And ultimately, the heart of the Rapid Response Network as a hotline and as a shelter is that no one stands alone in the community, is our slogan that I kind of helped create. But ultimately, it's that one deportation is not just one person. It impacts hundreds of people that are in their lives. It impacts the jobs, it impacts schools, it impacts churches, like it's all community. And that beyond legal counsel, as much as it is instrumental and crucial, that there are so many other basic needs in a family's life that are needed in the moment of crisis. And that's where the Rapid Response Network, but also just the collaboration amongst organizations came to fruition because of the gaps that were there. So that's kind of like the story of what's happened over the last couple of years. And in total, I believe the shelter has housed close to 20,000 individuals. More than half of those have been children. And that's going to keep growing. The numbers have decreased over the last few months since the adoption of MPP, which is the Remain in Mexico policy, which now means that folks are getting processed at the border and sent to detention, but then are not sent to detention, or just sent back to Mexico to wait for their court or for their hearing in front of a judge. So policies are shifting. We kind of have to remain flexible, and things are kind of changing as policies also come from the administration.
Any questions?
We had heard that when they sent them back to Mexico, they're putting dates on the form that are not valid dates.
Yeah. Yep. Yes. And
Can you repeat what you said?
yes, he's asking. He said that he saw that there was a report, and it actually kind of went viral recently, that the officers were putting fake dates on paperwork and sending people back. And they have their own system, like migrants have their own system. There's still about 3,000 to 4,000 migrants in Tijuana waiting for their numbers to be called, and they have their own internal. But authorities, also on the Mexican side, are responsible for helping people transport from the shelter or from where they are to the border, and are usually late or take them on the wrong date. So the collaboration isn't there. The documents, folks are crossing over sometimes with false names and phone numbers for sponsors, and then show up here too with like nowhere to go. So that like the data that is collected and that unfortunately is not very accurate, and there's no vetting system.
And I'm just going to add.
What did you say the number was in San Diego? I didn't hear that well. How many? You mentioned the number about immigrants in San Diego. I did not hear that number.
Undocumented?
Yes.
I believe it's 100,000 that are currently living
Thank you.
in San Diego County.
Thank you.
And we could never really fully know, right?
Yeah.
And I was going to say, I'm guessing too, with the date, it's important when you're seeking asylum, certain things have to happen in a certain amount of time. So, like, you have to apply for asylum within the first year of being here. So if dates are being, tampered with, yeah, that could affect a person's case for sure.
Well, what is the advantage of tampering the dates? Like, whose vested interest is that? If I'm an officer, but what, to shorten the time so that someone can't come in?
That's what I would think.
Yeah, and I also think it's just to like alleviate the load. Like they're trying to just process as much as they can and not being intentional about actually putting them through the process, just getting people through their numbers. So there's a number system that they're tracking, migrants are tracking, and they're trying to get through those. I think they typically go through 3 numbers a day, was the last thing I heard, and each number is about 25 cases. So they're not seeing very many at all. They don't have capacity.
Yeah, they're trying to get.
What I understand is that they had to have a date on the form when they sent them back to Mexico, so they just put any date on it just to get them out of the country.
Get people.
Yeah, and there's some folks that have been in Tijuana for almost a year now that are like establishing themselves there, like informally waiting for their date, that aren't working. They have family back in their countries in Central America or in other places that are even sending them money. I mean, they're trying not to work in Mexico. I think Mexico now has their own program, but yeah.
And there's another problem that's currently being addressed by the ACLU, and that is that people who come in that are seeking asylum, that under the new program, they just are being sent back to Mexico without being sent to detention. They are not even letting those people consult with attorneys. Even if they have an attorney, they're not letting them consult with those attorneys because they may take the position that sending them back to Mexico is in fact sending them back to danger, or they're at risk by being sent back to Mexico, and they're not being allowed to consult with attorneys.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to speak to the Episcopal Church part, but I'm actually going to broaden that a little bit because I was raised in the Roman Catholic tradition. And my son goes to a Lutheran school, and so I have an ecumenical bit about me. Churches have historically assisted those in need, right? Churches have historically helped those at the margins, the most vulnerable. And for where Denora and I are coming from, at this point we're talking about the most vulnerable being the migrants who are crossing, or who are here, who are seeking better lives for themselves, for their children. And I haven't been Episcopal super long, in the long grand scheme of my life, it's not been super long, but what I know of the diocese is that there's really good work being done. I can think of a few parishes offhand, and there are dozens more that I don't know, but really good work's being done to provide tutoring, to provide clothing, to help with shelter, to help get people connected. So that work is being done, and what we're wanting to do today is to try to take this conversation one step further. So I'll talk next a little bit about, Denora and I talk next a little bit more about it's our minds and our hearts and our feet. So getting ourselves into action. But I do want to talk a little bit what has happened in the Episcopal Diocese here in San Diego, I should say. So some of you may have heard the story of Constantine at St. Luke's. It had a lot, there's nodding heads, it had a lot of coverage, which is good. So if you don't know that story, there was a family that came from the Congo, and when they came in, immigration took dad away but kept mom and the kids together. Mom and the kids were ultimately released and made their way to San Diego, made their way to St. Luke's, and the dad Constantine remained in detention. And so by the grace of God and by the will of the people of St. Luke's, a lot was able to happen. So it had turned out like the case had not been handled correctly. They weren't sure what was going to happen with Constantine, but Colin and Laurel, and as well as others in the community, are very dedicated and have a background in community organizing and knew who to connect with, and connected not only with the Diocese of San Diego but beyond, right? So all hands were out in order to take care of the situation. I know, I'll just wait.
I've got a new
It's a
phone,
nice
I
ring,
can't even
though.
turn it off.
That's okay. At least it's not like a duck quacking or an alarm going off. I've been in meetings like that, so no worries. It's all good. Okay, so all hands were on deck, right? Everyone who could be organized and was willing to organize they were organized to get Constantine out of detention, get him a new attorney, get his case reopened, and ultimately he came back. And it was a beautiful day, truly, a beautiful day. I have the honor of working with his kids and know the family, and it was just really a beautiful day. Robin, you can attest to that, I think, too. But I want to say also a comparison. So in the work that I do as a mental health professional, I had a case with a family that was very similar to Constantine's family. From the Congo, dad was detained. He was in Texas, I think. Dad was detained in Texas. Mom was released with her 5 children, came to San Diego. She found a place of worship. I don't know what church she was at, but she had a place of worship. That church provided a lot of support to her. They helped her get housing. They helped get the kids, where they needed to be. She had an attorney, and there are many wonderful attorneys that provide services, but are not always immigration attorneys. They may have a background in a different area of law, but they step up to do the work, which I really think is a gift. But in this case, they didn't seem to get the support that they really needed in terms of their legal status. And on Christmas Day, I got a text message from my client saying that they had lost their asylum case. And I texted her, and I was like, whatever I could say in a text message to her. And then said, but I'll see you next week, and we can figure this out. We can figure out together, and the organization is behind you. We can figure out what can be done. They could have gone into the appeals process, which itself can be a daunting process as well. But then when we went to find the family, they had left. And we have no idea where they went. But their case, I sat down with my colleague and I was like, it's so similar. It's so similar. And so you can see why there is such a tremendous need for communities of faith to come together and to provide support. I know that we cannot help everybody. I know that there are people that won't cross our thresholds, but for those that do and those that are placed in front of us by God, that we are called to really help them. So, go ahead. Did you want to add anything?
Sure. We have a lot of stories, and we promised we wouldn't tell all of them because we don't have enough time. But there is also, there was a story on NPR about a Congolese mother. Do you remember that? And she came to the border and was separated from her daughter. 3-year-old daughter was sent to Chicago because that's where they had space for in a children's shelter. And I remember getting an email from a couple of older folks in Vista saying, I'm really moved by this, do you know anything? And I kind of ignored it because I'm really bad at emails and didn't think it was urgent. And then I got a call from ACLU, from Norma Chavez, and said, hey, we released the mother. The mother was released, and we have the attorneys with her. She can't stay at a hotel tonight. She is severely traumatized and needs to be in a home with people. Like she needs to be in a home, not in a hotel by herself. So I remember I was at Applebee's, and I, ordered one more drink and then started calling a bunch of people. And eventually connected with St. Thomas More in Vista, Oceanside, and said to Sister Maureen Brown, this is happening, can you help me find it? And honestly, in a room of people that I think I'm just gonna be honest, I thought I need to call a group of people that have the means and the resources to do this. And I knew that it wasn't going to be a parish in National City. I needed to call someone that could move their people quickly. Sister Marie quickly talked to some of her folks, and an elderly couple, I think their last name's the Boyles, called back and said, give me information. Is it safe? First, is it safe? Can we do this? And they took her in. And we didn't know how long it was, and we were totally transparent about that. She ended up staying with the family for about 2 weeks. And then the family and her went to Chicago and reunited with her daughter, and she now lives in Chicago. But this is an example of how attorneys can only do so much, legal agencies can only do so much, a shelter would not have been the place for that woman that night. She needed to be in a place, and I remember her, she was very excited that she saw that they had a Bible and that they were Christians, and she felt safe to also have a conversation about her journey and how faith played a role. So that we're in a moment, I think, right now where like we have to be really creative about how we're showing up and what our gifts are and what our resources are. That we're not looking for like professional interpreters or like attorneys, that there's a role for all of us to play right now. And that's kind of like the spirit that we had when we created the Rapid Response Network, and what I could contribute as an organizer or leading an organization of people of faith is that I know that there are moments like this where people don't need an attorney right now. They need someone to remind them what their purpose is and why things are happening the way they are. So I wanted to add to that because like these are two examples that are very, that are based on the value and importance of community.
Right. Yeah. And really being present. You're right. Like, and talking about that piece about a professional interpreter, that had come up last time. Like, I've got this skill. Do I need to like have training? But like, no, really being present is just huge. Like, I'm thinking about when Constantine came back, and right, like that the whole community came out to celebrate. Like, like to know that you're so loved and supported can make a huge difference in people's lives, really, truly, right? We've probably experienced that in our own lives, right? We're not that different, even though our stories may differ. So in terms of engaging our hearts, our minds, and our feet, that we as God's people are called to go deeper, right? So I was telling Denora, I was like searching for a scripture passage, and there are a gazillion, of course, because we are blessed with a scripture that says, welcome the stranger, come, open your doors. We have so many examples across the testaments that have been given to us. So, but then I was struck because one that kept coming up, and in the last session, someone was wearing a t-shirt that said John 3:16. And I called her yesterday and I said, this is going to be a little dramatic if I go like John 3:16. So John 3:16 is, so God so loved the world that he gave his only son, right? And you don't have to be a parent to know how much of a sacrifice it is to give your child, right? And so I was thinking of this in two ways. One is the families that sometimes have to leave their kids behind because it's just not safe for them to come with them. And many times people think they're going to be able to come to the United States and that process won't be very long, so they'll be able to send for their children. But that is not always the case. That's generally not the case. But then I was thinking for our point of view, so we are God's children as well. And God knows our nature. You read that in the scripture too. It is clear how we humans function. It does not matter if it was 3,000 years ago or now. To put yourself out there can be dangerous. Sometimes fatal. I don't think that's where we're going to go. But to put yourself out there means putting yourself on the line. But that we as Christians are rooted in the story of Jesus, and in that story, Jesus does not stand for the status quo. Amen. Thank you all. So Jesus calls us to agitate, to make change, and so we know. I don't want to speak for you, but I heard you say last time, like, this is not easy work. For every one step that I take forward with a client, there's sometimes 3 steps back. And for every time a client has success, he or she calls their attorney and says, our hands are tied, there's nothing we can do, we just have to wait. And the pain and the brutality of waiting and not knowing. I was saying earlier that I have a client who came with her husband and her children, and she's been here so long that she had another child, and that child is heading into preschool. And they don't know what will happen. They're still waiting in the asylum-seeking case. So we, as people of faith, are called to go deeper and to take action. And so we want to offer an opportunity to talk about that. We have some resources to provide to you to get your juices flowing. But we had talked to the bishop earlier, and Bishop Susan is in support of having this conversation continue. She, along with others, are going to a summit at the border at the end of November, and she wanted to bring that information back and what we gather here as well, and have this conversation continue, hopefully in person, but if not, at least like electronically in the new year, because as we move into Advent, we know that will be a lot of our time and energy. So as we move in, but this conversation should not and will not end here today.
And so there are very immediate, there's immediate things you could do now in terms of like what's happening at the border. The migrant shelter in San Diego is always in need of donations and volunteer time. We have some handouts where you can mark if those are things that you feel called to do now. There is information on the Rapid Response Network or immigration or this conversation you want to have back home. That could happen fairly soon as well. But more than anything, I think we want to spend some time brainstorming or give some time for all of you to reflect on how as an individual you're being called to step up right now. And also or perhaps if it's not just individual, what about your congregation? How do you imagine your congregation can play a role in the moment that we're living in now? And then also being realistic, what do you need? What are the resources or the training that you need to understand what's happening, to get people moving, if that's where you're being called? And then if there's next steps that you want to take, do you want to have a conversation with your fellow congregants when you get back home, or with your pastor? Are there specific things that you want to do when you leave this room? We didn't plan out to have like a whole resource manual for today, but we want to commit to having that for you when after this gathering, because we understand that there's tons of things that you could do now. Folks, the earlier session, we're talking heavily about sponsorship and the dire need for folks that are coming without a point of contact. And that means that instead of being at the shelter for 2 days, some folks, there was a family, Reina's family was at the shelter for, I think, 8 months before they found a family that would sponsor them in New York. I think she's at now. But these are things but they're big. It's a big ask, right, to sponsor a family for who knows how long. But there are things that can happen now, and we will send all of that information. We will send, we could map out together what's happening in San Diego and how you could plug in if you wish. But also we wanted mostly to give an opportunity for you all to brainstorm and get creative about the things that you're imagining you individually could do and or also your congregation.
So you're
Does that make sense? Or is that helpful?
Can you explain a little more about what it means to sponsor a family?
Yeah. So the very basic thing is that when someone is in detention or is released at the migrant shelter, they'll show up sometimes even with the shelter address and a name from the shelter. Like Border Patrol now, our agents are it's so normal for them to send people. However, that is an obstacle for the process because they need a physical address and a home for them to go to their court, for them to continue the process for asylum. Which means that if it is Amy, if it's Amy on that one, their phone number, that is where they're coming to live essentially in your home or in the address that you've given them. The process could be a month to years, depending on the system and depending on the flow of the administration as well. And it means that you're responsible for all of their housing needs. If they come with children, it means that you are supporting them and finding a school for them as well. And it is also a financial, you don't have to give them money, but taking care of those expenses and their living expenses as well.
What to say though, too, with some of that like kind of around case management, there could be organizations that they could be plugged into too,
Right.
So that wouldn't necessarily have to all fall on the sponsoring family.
How is that affected by the Remain in Mexico policy? In other words, if an asylum seeker comes in and the new policy is that they have to wait in Mexico, is there still, are they able to avoid that if they can provide the name of a sponsor where they can stay, or are they still going to be required to go back to Mexico?
My understanding is that they're still being sent back to Mexico. And so the difference is that in the beginning, when that wasn't in place, that we had anywhere from 200 to 300 people per day coming to the shelter. Now it's 30 to 80 at the most. So they're still being sent back to Mexico.
Well, there's still people coming, and you all may have heard, but San Diego is really expensive. So even if they're here, people can't always afford it. People can't afford it. So to have additional support in that way, to have doors open to let people in, so people have stability, that's still a big deal. So even if it's not somebody who's immediately crossed, there continues to be a need for a ton of support from the community.
Comment? Oh, she was first.
Go ahead.
I've heard you say a couple times there are tons of things that you can do. I'm just not clear. I've heard about sponsorships, both in this and the previous workshop, but I haven't heard about the other things that we might be able to do or how we find out about those.
Yeah, to that point, if I could. My name is Marshall. One of the things that I'm very excited about in this conversation is finding those concrete things that can be done. Because up until you take action, you're just adding to the angst. One of the things to consider, and I know everyone's different, everyone has different interests and abilities, but one of the things I think would be very important to consider is how we could work together to take our efforts and combine them under a single kind of activity, so that not only can we support one another, but we can maybe be more effective in whatever it is that is decided that we do. Just a thought.
Yeah. Well, we had thought about that as well, and we will talk to your point as well. But that, yes, coming together, that's why it felt to me, and I think to you as well, Denora, that having the conversation to make sure the bishop was on board to continue this conversation. And even as she was walking out, she was saying, yes, we need to get together and have a strategy. So, one, have a strategy on how we could all do this together, right, as a diocese, but also so you know who is doing what and what can be tapped into in the diocese, but then with the resources that there are agencies doing work. So like last time they were talking about, right, I think it was the sponsor, like there's an agency also that helps
Safe Harbors.
connects, what was it?
Safe Harbors?
Safe Harbors helps connect families. So you wouldn't actually be on your own if you decided to sponsor. There's an agency that can help. So letting the community know about these organizations that already exist, as well as continuing to work together to create some strategies for the diocese in particular. And then I want to take your question, but I don't want to go away from yours either. But go ahead, Beck.
I was wondering if these people who are here and have been granted
Assignment?
kind of freedom to stay in the
Oh,
U.S.
okay.
While they wait for determination, are they able to work and earn any money, or is that forbidden?
Eventually they're able to work. Eventually they can get a work permit, and then they're able to legally work. It takes, it's at least, like you have to wait like 180 days to apply.
6 months.
Yeah, and then you will get a work permit. So yeah, so an asylum seeker is very much incredibly vulnerable and at the mercy of those who are willing to help them. Yes. Did someone else have a question?
I had a question that maybe touches on what Deborah was asking. But at St. Paul's Cathedral, we have a group called Integrity.
Okay.
It's strictly focused on the LGBTQ community. And our own group at St. Paul's has gotten together and we try to strategize of what we could do. What are all the myriad of things that, as a group, we would like to do. And one of our priority efforts that we talked about was dealing with the immigration issue. And how could we possibly reach out to LGBTQ immigrants, whether they're trying to cross or whether they're already back in Mexico, and to just provide them obviously a very specific type of support. So that's taking more broader question and narrowing it down to maybe
Well, I wonder
one
if we should just
specific
touch on things,
group
like,
within
yeah.
the immigrants.
Yeah, so, yeah, it's like a bunch of things. So, I think in terms for this conversation, I mean, if there's a dire need right now, in terms of like the border crisis and what we're doing, like we need people on the ground that are willing to show up when there's ICE enforcement in communities and get trained on how to document and report ICE enforcement. So through the Rapid Response Network, there's trainings that can happen individually, but then also through the entire congregation that trains volunteers to do that. We need we're looking for volunteers, especially in North County, where enforcement tends to happen more often, immediately. There's a shortage all the time. We also operate the hotline at a volunteer basis. So we're looking for bilingual Spanish speakers, English speakers that can dedicate some time throughout the week to take phone calls and be the connectors to all of these pieces. There are needs of donations and time inside the shelter. And then there's also, and I think the purpose of also brainstorming is that I also understand that every congregation's capacity and resources are different. And that the approach we've had throughout this entire process, other than like the responding and dispatching portion of it, is that we want folks to really dig into their own gifts and capacities and name what it is that they're able to contribute, or the way that they want to step up or show up as a congregation. So there are concrete things, like those are things that from where we are coming from, we can say we can plug you in now, we can connect you and get trained or bring a training to your congregation, but also with the option of like, you could do this individually, but also as a congregation, what's the conversation you're having back home with your pastor and your team, like your congregation, about as a whole, as a body, a faith community, how are we showing up? Then that is really beyond just like the list of things you can do, but this is also more even like a vision, right? Like in this moment, who do we want to be and what do we need to get there? That's how I'm willing and really excited to think about that with you as well. And that's kind of the conversation we want to have with the bishop afterward too.
There is already an organization of parishes, the Diocesan Outreach and Justice Coalition, and that meets every quarter. And at the moment we have only about 20 parishes, but that is a way of getting this information of volunteers needed and issues that you have, and contacting Safe Harbor out to those parishes all at the same meeting. And we're wanting other parishes to join. And there's information out in the courtyard about the coalition, if you're interested in joining it.
And there's also a ton of need for advocacy, which is like a little outside this conversation, but not really. I mean, at the county level, the county building we have now, our lease ends at the end of the year. So they're currently looking for a new location because the county is no longer willing to take the responsibility. So we're constantly advocating, even at the state level with our governor, and at the county level with supervisors, to step in and support all of this so that it's not just always community-based. So the advocacy is ongoing. The county budget process is about to start. It gets adopted early in the year of 2020. There's also a county race in District 3 that's super important and could potentially also change the political landscape of San Diego, and also a presidential campaign happening next year that is super, super important, or kind of important, right? And not to mention also the census in 2020. Where migrants and just all immigrants in general are feeling the fear again and the anxiety again with the citizenship question. So it's like, I think right now, like the need is super deep and multi-layered. And so we don't want to overwhelm you with like sign up to do all these things. It's mostly like thinking about there's all these obstacles or opportunities ahead of us. What role or what role can my church play, if anything?
Yeah. But the needs that you have, you really need, I think, to list them.
So we need to give you the handout.
Yes. Oh.
that all we have?
How do you plug into refugee net?
Oh, to refugee net?
And I can take them to the next summit meeting.
I mean, I know we do tutoring, but
No, we have more.
that's it. We do
Oh,
tutoring.
yeah.
But how do they-
If you write that down, well, they help certainly with support. Not necessarily, my understanding is not, I don't know about the other, like case management stuff. Yeah, but write that down that you're interested in and find out. I don't know the answer to that at this point, to be honest.
You have more than
I think we ran out. Do folks take that?
Question,
Yes.
how difficult is it to provide sponsored families? There you wind up somebody who's released, and you spoke earlier, they need a place, you know, they've been there for 2 weeks, they've been there for 2 months. How tough is it to find that?
Currently?
Yes.
Oh, it's like impossible. They typically, so it's, the shelter is run by Jewish Family Service, and they usually will call me and ask me if I know a family that would take them. It's working with the caseworkers, so they're either not doing it because it's just like not protocol, but when there is a need, they'll usually reach out to the community organization, which is us, and ask us. It happens maybe a couple times a year, and just because we don't have the capacity for it yet. Like our aspiration, our dream is to create like this, I call it accompaniment, it doesn't have to be called that, but this arm that would be where we have systems in place that has people already vetted, that we've created a protocol or a procedure where families and homes are vetted, but that is currently not in place yet. And even places like Safe Harbor are also like maxed out, so it doesn't happen as often.
Well, it would seem to me that would be, you know, there would be, if a parish is going to be involved, would at least do a survey of the parishioners as to who might
Great
be
idea.
willing, you know, given the right circumstances, at least have a place to start from when you are out there, you know, please, you know, kind of thing. And at St. Timothy's, I hope, you know, I'm not sure anybody would say, give early,
Right.
but the worst thing they can say is no. If I don't ask, I already know the answer.
But what's involved in the vetting to be able to be a home?
We don't have that yet. We haven't created that, and there isn't a place that does that yet. So we'd have to figure that out, and talk to probably immigration lawyers to figure that out.
Isn't one of the biggest problems people fearful? People afraid that this is against the law. If I help out somebody, it's against the law. So how does that get taken care of? So that we can move forward and be the people we should be, rather than, I mean, even the whole sanctuaries thing, I mean, people left us because that's what we were supporting. You know? So how do you do that?
Well, I mean, so, go ahead.
Asylum seekers are,
They're here legally.
they're here, yeah,
They're
that's
here
the plain
legally, yeah.
words.
They're not undocumented.
Oh, okay.
They wouldn't be an
That's the
undocumented
difference.
immigrant, yeah, and asylum, see that, and to be completely fair, in the media, right, like, that does not sound like that's the case, right? But if someone comes to the border at a port of entry or anywhere, have they changed that yet? No, they're wanting to change that, you usually could come with a visa, come without a visa, say I'm seeking asylum, you are here legally.
Yeah,
So,
but I don't mean to repeat a wrong song here, but under the current rule, which is remain in Mexico, those asylum seekers are being sent back to Mexico. So what is the opportunity to give them shelter here if the process is automatically returning them to Mexico?
People are still coming. So we still have anywhere from 30, I think in the last few months, the most has been 100 that are coming. I think maybe twice, 2 days they had 100. So people are still coming, just at a far slower rate.
like, they're able to cross.
They're able to
and
cross,
stay.
and they process the same way that they did before. Most of them are not Central American though. There's a lot more, I think the Russian, a lot more Haitian, so from other countries are still coming.
And are they allowed to stay,
Yes.
or are they
Yes.
returned to Mexico?
No,
And why are they allowed to stay?
Some of them,
I mean, you can answer that, but like, we didn't design that.
It's a loading
We didn't design that, right?
I know.
If it were up to Sonora, no, it'd probably be different,
and
but.
it's like, I don't know if it's a secret, but like, the immigration system is not perfect. Like, and they don't have, and there's like
Like a lot of
no,
other things that aren't perfect.
and they also don't have like, nothing is consistent.
Right.
Nothing is ever the same. You can have two exact cases and one of them is released, one of them is not. Like, it really, this is like not being funny. It could depend on the judge's mood.
Yep.
It could depend on whether or not what they're wearing, they like what they're wearing. Like,
Yep.
there's no consistency.
Yep.
So even like some of our answers are right and some are wrong. Like, there's nothing to really point to.
And it's political.
Yeah.
I mean, it's political, right? It's like who is allowed and who is not, right? And so I can't tell you why, I can speculate, but I can't tell you why Russians are able to cross and stay, right? But people are crossing and staying. There are people who are crossing the border and staying on this side, they're not sent back.
Then it goes back to the question this young lady asked over here.
His
which-
wife.
Which is, then I think it's incumbent upon someone, if someone is here and able to stay, it's incumbent upon someone who's looking for shelter or for a sponsor to be able to ensure the potential people who are offering their sponsorship,
Yeah.
to ensure them that these
Yeah.
people are legally in the
Yeah.
country.
There would have to be vetting of those who are offering sponsorship as well as who is going to be placed in homes. And there would have to be an education and training and orientation, of course.
So with the Congolese family, the vetting for the couple was through us. I mean, really, it wasn't that much, but it was like these were two parishioners from a church that is a member of SCOP. Like, it wasn't a random couple that we just found that said yes. And the family, the mother came with the ACLU attorney and had a conversation with the host family to explain the process and the expectations. And then, so it's not that, like, there isn't a formality, which is kind of like good and not, because like, this happens ad hoc, and it also just happens when there's need, and people usually just step up and we figure it out everything after, sometimes.
So are they primarily Central Americans and Mexicans that is being sent back?
Yes.
Primarily?
Yes.
So all others, whether they're African nation oriented or Russian or wherever,
And
they're
also-
the ones that are pretty much following the same regulations, or being allowed in under the same
Most
regulations that
consistent.
had been in force.
Yes, and it also depends which part of the border they come through. So this is more of a tendency in San Isidro, like the San Isidro. It also depends on like the authority, like the Mexican authorities and their communication with folks and how they're bringing them in or not. So there's nothing consistent. And I wanted to also come back to the LGBT part of it. I had a conversation with a group in Tijuana that works with LGBT asylum seekers that are waiting in Mexico. To my knowledge, I don't know I haven't met a group that has crossed in San Diego in a while of LGBT folks. So I'm really curious, and we should connect afterward, because I think that there's also a crucial need to create a network of welcoming families or hosts on this side, in the case that happens, because if they're single mostly, they wouldn't be taken in at the shelter.
Right.
The shelter only takes family units.
So if you didn't get a sheet, please, and you want more information about what you can do and what next steps are, give us your email afterwards. Come up and we'll give you your email address, okay?
Just a clarification on the fear question. I thought I heard a soundbite earlier about, well, if you're helping someone, you could also have legal consequences. Was there, did you guys mention
Yeah,
something?
there was some conversation
There-
about that, but maybe it was in a particular context that got that. There was some, in terms of sanctuary and everything, there was some mention made of legal repercussions, something about if you're the one who opens the door.
Yeah, but
That
that's
was it.
different. That's different.
Oh,
But
no.
go ahead.
So for
That's not-
education,
That
to
wouldn't,
share-
that wouldn't be Kathleen opening the door, right? she'll clarify. Denora will
Oh, yeah,
clarify.
so I was talking about, so when we do know your rights for undocumented people, and we say if ICE comes to your door, you have the right not to open the door. So that's a common, well, know your rights language and steps for undocumented folks. And then, but when we talk about the census, I said there's a contradiction where we say, where our message is gonna be, if an enumerator comes to your door, open the door. So for folks that are undocumented and only see a badge, there could be confusion and fear that they might be the same. And then there could be also the confusion of opening the door for an ICE agent for thinking it's an enumerator. So that there's just like there's gonna be a need for a lot of community education around what an enumerator looks like and what or like an ICE enforcement agent looks like.
But I think what I was hearing you ask too is, so Denora had said like, so say there's a deportation order on me, I open the door, my family is there, there's no deportation order on them, we all go, right? Is that
Maybe,
what you
or who's the homeowner that is sheltering?
They're
Granted a place to stay for that assignment.
Okay, so that's unrelated.
Yeah.
I was talking about collateral arrests, meaning that
Yeah,
if,
that was the word you used.
so
Yeah.
collateral arrest means that if I have my family in the car, if ICE stops me, they have the right to ask all of us in the car for documents. So this has nothing to do whether or not I'm a citizen or not. It simply means like, if I'm undocumented and get pulled over, actually what I meant was, if ICE is looking for me and they've tracked me, because that's what they do, they investigate and know where to find you. They come and they find the nota, but I also have all of my family with me. They legally have a right to question them and take them too. So although we're saying we're only deporting priorities, they're also doing like double, triple, fourth whammies and are taking 4 people along with the person that was a priority for deportation.
If they're undocumented.
Right,
Right.
not related to, no.
Suppose somebody's in that car that is a legal citizen by way of birth. Are they, is ICE allowed to send them, deport them too?
No. But if they mistaken you or say, hey, you fit this, because you could say, I'm a US citizen, but because you've talked to them, that gives them the right to question everyone else too.
Okay. So I know it's lunch, and I want to honor that. If you, take the time to fill out the sheet that Denora had. If you didn't get one, please give us your email if you'd like more information.
There are more sheets here.
Oh, there they are. Oh, no, those are different. If you don't have time to fill out this one right now, I'm here until tomorrow, so you can find me. Okay, thank you all. Thank you.